All right. Browser notification is out. We're just waiting for this to stream on YouTube. And we'll be going in just a moment.
Cool.
All right. Kill that. Pull this up so I can see my friend Ryan Olkey. Hey, everyone. Thank you for joining us yet again for our second episode of Inhabit. I am Corey DeVos. I am here with my very good friend, Ryan Olkey. Ryan, how you doing, man?
Doing good, thanks.
Good.
Glad to see you again, man.
Yeah, no, I'm super stoked that we're doing our second episode. We did our first episode last week where we were just sort of introducing the show and letting people know just sort of what we will be up to in coming months.
Yeah.
And I'm excited to sort of jump in today. So I was thinking, Ryan, a couple things. We want to tell people what we're going to be talking about today.
Yep.
I also just want to sort of, I think, remind people why we're doing this show.
Yeah.
And sort of what we're looking to get at together
Yes.
through doing the show together. So maybe you can sort of remind people of what we're doing.
Yeah. So there's a couple ways we can talk about what we're doing with the show. And I was really happy to see the response to our first episode. It really seemed like there was a visceral response, which is exactly the kind of response we're looking for this show Inhabit. There's something that felt embodied about how people responded. So inside the integral community, if we're going to be really specific, we know that integral theory is very cognitively heavy. It's a mental workout, and it's incredibly useful. So the mind is part of who we are, and integral theory gives us really great ways of viewing and understanding the world and our experience. At the same time, it can be very easy to stay in that world where we're mainly in the mind and relating to the world in a cerebral way, which again is included in our experience, but it's not limited to that. So I think a lot of people who are naturally drawn to, say, philosophy or integral theory, one of the struggles can be embodying fully all of who we are, incorporating and downloading and integrating and permeating our experience with what we sense through integral theory. So put it really simply, I mean, this is called integral life. So, we're really emphasizing the life part, the living part here, complementing the theory and the maps. So, as you'll see with our episode titles, they have a very simple focus. So inhabit the territory of you. That was the first one. And we wanted to, specifically say territory, like your lived experience. And then today is inhabit your spiritual life. So this is going to be the format. Every episode is we're going to really look in one domain of our life, and as much as we can practically examine that and work with our experience around that domain. So that's what I would say comes up for me. I don't know if you anything to add in terms of what we're doing, and then I know we can frame today's episode a little bit more too.
Yeah, totally. Well, no, I think that was a beautiful setup. And I do think that one of the things that makes, the integral approach to spirituality so, appealing to a lot of people is that it's, there's a lot of intellectual sort of rigor that comes with it. It's sort of a spirituality for smart people in a certain kind of way, right?
Right.
But at the same time, it can be so intellectual, especially since, as you mentioned, it can be just so cognitive and so heady, because the way we're generally, taking this material on is by reading books and watching presentations and all that.
Yeah.
Sometimes we can get sort of lost in the intellectual components of this. And I think that sometimes when we get so sort of suffused with these beautiful ideas, these big ideas, these grand narratives of life, the universe, and everything, we sort of lose touch with the ordinariness of it all. You know what I mean? There's we get sort of caught up in the semiotics of enlightenment and in the sort of the mythology of self and the divinization of the universe, and everything gets so big and so spiritual and so meta, you know what I mean? That it's at the end of the day, we want to sort of help people, maybe collapse that a little bit and maybe find a little bit more simplicity. Maybe, there's the sort of Zen cliche, Ryan, that we were talking about pre-show of, at first in the beginning, the mountain is a mountain. And then in the second stage, the mountain is not a mountain anymore. Mm-hmm. It's not a mountain. It's this spectrum of dancing energies and lights and shadows and projections and perceptions and all of that. But then stage 3, the final stage, the mountain is a mountain again. And the only difference between first stage mountain and third stage mountain is at the first stage, the mountain is on that side of my face.
Yes.
And at the end, the mountain is on this side of my face. Mm-hmm. And I've always really, really loved that sort of cliche, because it emphasizes just the radical simplicity, the radical ordinariness of the spiritual territory, and how we oftentimes, overly complicate things in a certain kind of way.
Yeah. And actually, I want to bookmark, make sure to come back around to that model that you just had there, because I think it's actually more than a cliche, to be honest. It's a fine, simple model for awakening. And
all cliches are cliches for a reason, right?
Yeah, exactly. And we're reducing or hopefully eliminating the gap of experience, and this is about intimacy. So, and I've used this quote all over the place, but Dogen says enlightenment is intimacy with all things. And in that third stage of the mountain is now a mountain again, there's intimacy with it. So I think that's the thing that can happen, is we can lose intimacy. Another just silly example that pops in my head a lot is sex, which of course sex pops in my head a lot, but it has a practical purpose here, is that like you can have a bunch of theories and talk about sex, but what do you want to do? You want to have the sex. That's the point. Now that's overtly that way. And it is good to talk about sex. And, in this day and age, it's become more important, but that's just sort of thing. It's like, you want to be engaged with life, so that's what we're trying to do here.
I'm laughing over here because it reminds me, I've had this criticism of myself and of Integral Life over the last decade or so, which is, we know sex sells. Right. And yet when Integral tries to sell sex, it's like, let's have these massive, complicated discussions about gender dynamics and sex, masculine and feminine polarities and all of that. And it's like, what people really want to talk about is, fucking.
Yeah, it really is. And it's not to downplay the importance of having those discussions. It really is. You just got to know where it starts feeling like an avoidance of intimacy. Like, is it helpful? And if it is, then it's moving me towards intimacy so that I can participate in life, versus being a witness to it constantly, and no one can say that. You have to look at your own experience to decide, and get feedback from who you're in relationships with. Yeah. Are you showing up? So I think that's a really great intro. And, especially in this episode, inhabiting your spiritual life and the model you gave in the Zen tradition. And real quick, I want to read that question just so we can show we're going to do this question, and I'm going to guide a practice, and I'll talk about that in a minute. So we're going to do a little practice up front, and then we'll explore much more in depth the question we got from a user, which I think our listener, which helped frame this thing, and we're going to dive into more.
And Ryan, since you're going to be tasked with answering the question, in order for me to feel useful here, why don't I just read it?
Yeah, sure. Perfect. Great.
And then this question, I think, will frame a lot of the discussion that we're going to have over the next hour.
Sounds good.
So let's see here. The question was, and this came through about a week and a half ago, through the Integral Life field. I think, Ryan, this question might have actually been originally addressed to Ken Wilber for the Ken Show.
Oh yeah, that's right.
But I sort of hijacked it and said, this show that we're doing together will be a great place to sort of unpack this. So the question is, I have been meditating for a few years now. Specifically during the last year and a half, I've turned it into a daily practice. Good for you. My question is how to link that meditation space with action. How do I link within the same day my meditation space with my daily activities? And I'm not referring to the contemplative or meditating mind to be fully present or aware in what I'm doing. My question falls into the other side of the equation. It's on how the meditation springs to action or is reflected in the active part of the day. whether interacting with others or working on my own. In other words, how does my daily meditation guide my daily actions? And I'm not talking about the big picture actions, but more the daily chores. And that's from Don Mijares, I think his last name is. And thank you for the question, Don. It's a really great and important question that I think really sort of gets at the heart of what we're talking about today, which is the difference between our spiritual maps and the actual lived moment to moment territory.
Yes, that's a very good question. And, Corey, if I can plug myself briefly for a practical purpose. So my work as a teacher of awakening is called Awakening in Life. And I named it that specifically for this question. There's so much in it. And especially this particular episode, we're really diving into that. And I'm finishing up a sort of in-depth practical guide for Awakening in Life that has some principles and some maps and practices in it that I will put out this week, and people can find that at awakening.training. Now, I'm throwing it out there because if you're interested in some of the things I say, there's some more stuff behind it, and I'll reference things like that. So putting that out there, but I was really happy to see this because I'm like, this is exactly what gets me excited. So maybe we'll do a practice now. Yeah. And then we'll circle back around. So the practice we're going to do today, last time we did a practice of arriving, which is basically, I'd consider sort of like a protocol to begin practice, and that's to arrive in the space you're at. So I want to provide practices that build on top of each other and that you can take and cultivate this depth of intimacy, spiritually speaking, and also across other domains of life. So go back and listen to that episode for that more in-depth guidance on the arriving practice. Today, I wanted to do a somatic practice that I have from one of my teachers, Judith Blackstone. And she calls this, it's a mouthful, attuning to fundamental consciousness, but I call it just a simple embodiment practice. And we're going to do the very stripped down version of it, and we're going to do a shorter version of it. I have a longer version of it, 17 minutes about, and that's on, you can find on awakening.training. Today, we're going to try to do about 10 minutes. So I'm just acknowledging that we might be moving this along a little quicker, but I encourage you to slow it down on your own. And this practice is explicitly inhabiting the body. So we'll just get started. So take a moment to really arrive at where you're at. And, you can take in the space, look around, see what you see, hear what you hear. Your smell those smells. I have incense burning, so I can smell that. These are just simple acknowledgement of the sensory experience. And take a few deep breaths, slow inhalation. Let the exhale go wherever it wants to go. And if you can, when you take in that slow inhalation, see if you can sense the very core of your body and making contact, the core of your body with your inhalation. Now close your eyes if they're not already closed. And feel the contact your feet is making with the floor or whatever is beneath your feet. Really sense the physical contact your feet are making. And feel as if there's no separation between your feet and the floor. Now come into the internal space of your feet Here you're not aware of your feet. You are the internal space of your feet. You're living as and in the internal space of your feet. And don't worry if this doesn't feel complete or full. Allow yourself to just gently inhabit more and more the internal space of your feet. And when you do this practice on your own, you can take all the time you need to come home into the internal space of your feet and your body. Resting inside the internal space of your feet. As you breathe in, see if you can stay down this far in your body, down in your feet, that when you inhale, you don't lift up out of your feet. And even if you do lift up out of your feet, you can just notice that movement that probably was unconscious before. You can be curious about that. Now coming into the internal space of your ankles and your lower legs up to your knees. Again, you're inhabiting the internal space to the very core of your ankles and lower legs. Not outside them, not on the surface, not above, but letting yourself really rest inside the internal space of your lower legs. Coming into the internal space of your knees. And here, see if you can find the very centers of both knees at the same time. You might notice that these points waver or oscillate, and that's okay. You can find one point at a time and then both together. And as these points start to settle, you'll notice a settling of the mind. Stillness and balance of the mind will be revealed. Coming into the internal space of your thighs, from your knees all the way up to your hip sockets. Resting in the internal space of your upper legs. Now coming into your pelvis, to the internal space of your pelvis, allowing yourself to rest downward to the floor of your pelvis. And here you can sense the physical contact your sits bones is making with whatever you're seating on. Again, see if you can allow yourself to stay down in your internal space of your pelvis even as you inhale. Now find the centers of both hip sockets at the same time. You might need to allow your awareness to settle down a little deeper, not resting on the surface, but really resting in the centers of both hip sockets. And here you can feel and sense your lower body, your legs, at the same time as your upper body and your torso. Now coming into the internal space of your abdomen, from your pelvis up to your ribs, in the front of your stomach, all the way through your lower back. Really feel like you're coming into the full volume of your abdomen. And as you come into this part of your body, you might find that you naturally want to move or shift, and that's okay. Now coming into the internal space of your chest, from your sternum up to your collarbone, and all the way through the back, through your shoulder blades. Again, gently and patiently, seeing how much you can rest in the internal volume of your chest. Now coming into the internal space of your shoulders, allowing them to soften and relax. Coming in to the centers of both shoulder sockets at the same time. Coming into your upper arms, elbows, forearms, wrists, palms of your hands, and your fingers. Coming into the full internal space of your arms all at once. And that you are this internal space. Coming into the internal space of your neck. Allowing yourself to rest downward in the internal space of your neck. Also coming into the internal space all the way down through your collarbones. Coming into the internal space of your forehead, around through your temples. Here, see if you can find a small point in the very center of your forehead, not between your eyebrows, but up a little bit above that, in the very center of your forehead. This point might not appear in your mind, or maybe it does and it moves around, and that's okay. Let's see if you can allow yourself to settle. Allow this point to settle in the very center of your forehead. You can imagine, visualize it as a little point of light. Now you can drop back behind that point as if you're seeing it from inside your mind. Coming into your eyebrows and your eyes, deep into your eye sockets, allowing your eyes to smooth and become continuous with your face. Coming into the internal space of your nose, your lips, mouth, chin, your jaw, and your cheekbones. Coming into the very centers of your ears. Now inhabiting the internal space of your brain from the front to the back, allowing yourself to rest in this internal space. Inhabiting the internal space of your head all at once. Seeing if you can find the very center of your head between your ears with very subtle and refined awareness. Now inhabit your whole body all at once. Experience living as one singular internal space of your body with nothing left out. Now, without leaving your body, see if you can sense the space in the room or the space of wherever you're at. And that the space that pervades you also pervades the room. And this is just one continuous space. And now slowly open your eyes. And again, inhabit the internal space of your body all at once. And attune and sense the space of the room. And again, this is one continuous, pervasive space. Okay. I don't know how long that was, but hopefully
Ryan,
not.
That was gorgeous.
Great. I hope.
And what I if it can we
yeah,
reflect on that a little
yeah.
bit, because what I notice right now is coming out of that space and into this space is it's sort of like I can feel the blood sort of coming back up to my brain in a certain kind of way. You know what I mean? And I think what you just offered, the practice you just offered, which was tremendously simple but powerful. It's an opportunity, I think, to sort of tease apart all the various ways that we enact and illuminate ultimate reality. Right? So as you're going through that, you're not only creating sort of this cohesive integration of the body itself, but when you're telling us to inhabit the internal space of our ankles, right? You're enacting reality in a different way from that space. And I noticed sort of different qualities shifting from, for example, from the ankles to the pelvis. And both of which were an opportunity for mind to sort of like take a step back and say, okay, there's other ways to perceive this reality. There's other ways to relate with this sort of moment to moment spontaneous arising of experience.
Yes.
That isn't necessarily so cognitive. And the challenge of, you know, as I'm feeling those sensations and as I'm just sort of trying to notice, you can also feel mind sort of like generating all this noise and trying to sort of track everything that's happening. And I've got this little internal monologue that's sort of narrating the experience for me. And I, you know, have to sort of be careful that I don't fall into, again, sort of this, this mental chatter that, you know, and obviously, you know, doing the practice over and over again helps reduce that chatter. But it's nice to do a practice like this because you can just feel how differently you relate to these things just by focusing on different parts of your own body and different parts of your own sort of sensory experience.
Yeah. Thanks, Corey. That was really great. And right on. And, you know, there's so much to say. This practice is very, very simple, and there's even more to this foundational practice, but it provides us with so much. There's so many things to explore and layers here, but just to say that, you know, when we talk about mental chatter coming up, basically we're talking about attention and awareness collapsing onto a part of our experience. Now, we've been talking about mental, but it could be reactivity too. It could be emotional. So for example, we can collapse on anxiety, right? We might be having a really intense experience of anxiety and we're aware of nothing else. So this can happen in really profound, debilitating ways, but also can happen in very simple ways. Just attention awareness collapses. So what this practice does is it's trying to say, let's not have it collapse. Because this body we're in, this life we're in is our birthright. It's inherent. It's who we are. So there's no objective reason that we should be, you know, dissociating from our feet, you know, or our stomachs, you know, and then of course qualities that correlate to them. There's no reason that we should or have to do that. So here we're just coming back in and inhabiting it. And then this very much applies to anything else we're doing. This quality of what that feels like to really inhabit and try to show up more fully in our own bodies is going to be similar to whether we're talking about politics or social media. It's just that those are going to be much more complex domains that invite us to get collapsed and, worked up.
Yep.
So anyways, there's a lot we could talk about that, but hopefully that was helpful.
Yep. Well, and I think just to mention,
yep.
Ryan, I think there's also a breadcrumb trail leading from that practice you just guided for us to Don's question. I think,
yes.
yeah, Don's question, which is, again, as we're coming out of that experience, I can feel sort of, the way I framed it was I can feel the blood returning to my head. And the opportunity here is like, okay, well, and that's fine. You can return to mind, but keep all of this that we just, went through together, keep that online simultaneously. And that I think is a challenge that Don is asking about. How do I carry this forward? How, how can I make it so that every action I'm taking in the world is sort of its own meditation in a certain
way. So there's there's going to be a lot of things we're going to talk about with this. But first I would say we don't need to have a model of perfection. That itself is an obstacle. So like if we have some spiritual ideal that somehow we're going to always be super illuminated, or whatever our description might be, that's just not going to be the case. And when I talk about awareness or intention collapsing, that's going to happen. That's guaranteed because it's part of the human experience. And whether or not we want to assert that it's possible to 100% always maintain that kind of presence, whatever, I have my doubts about that. Mm-hmm. But can we cultivate a deeper capacity to be less fragmented, to come back to ourselves and to come back to presence after feeling fragmented? Yes, we can do that. So that's really important. But another interesting thing is like when we did that practice, if you have an experience in that meditation where you really felt present, where you didn't feel like there's a separation between you and your body and what you're experiencing, there's not two things. The question comes up is like, what else is needed? That was what I've asked from that perspective. And especially when we open our eyes, right, and we're doing this attunement to the space outside of our bodies and inside of our bodies, this whole question of separation and how do I integrate starts to fade away because you aren't separating things. Especially by grounding in the body, we're not creating a separation. We're saying, I want to be present in this form, in this life. Now we're centering that on our individual experience in our individual body, but by extension, that would be the same thing as it being a part of a we, or being a part of this physical world. There's not going to be a separation. So I think it's about how you approach practice. That's one, is like, what are your assumptions and how are you practicing? So if we were to practice that, we were attuning to awareness, right? Mm-hmm. Now we can experience the quality of awareness without doing it in the body. You know what I mean? We can actually just let go completely of the body. And that's an interesting experience, to just drop body, and try to attune and abide as pure awareness, right? Mm-hmm. The question's going to come up though, after you come out of that experience, is now what, right? So if it was just like, qualities of awareness of being vast, open, luminous, pure, okay, oh, wow, that's a profound experience. And that's part of who we are. But then you come back to the body, you're like, whoop, now what? So we're just using this practice, but that can happen with any practice, where the more it's disconnected from the body, the more that we're not using life itself as the medium of our practice, so the more that we're going to create an obstacle to separate, of feeling like separated. Now, there's some other things to say here that often, and when you gave the example in Zen of a mountain is a mountain, a mountain's not a mountain, a mountain's a mountain, 3 stages of awakening. When the mountain is a mountain, the first stage, it's unconscious relating. We don't have a conscious relationship to it. So what we do is we disembed, we start dismantling and disembedding from life in order to fully see it. So we start breaking down experience in various ways, right? So, in Buddhist practice, you can have things of breaking down sight. There's the object, there's the eyes seeing it, then there's mental formations of it, and all these things that happen. And like, holy crap, I'm breaking it all down. And this idea that I have of mountain and the concept of a mountain doesn't hold up. There's not that concept of mountainness, So we disembed. So we see that more clearly. We see the emptiness of it. We see the interconnected, interdependent arising of what makes a mountain. But we kind of have to go through this natural phase of disembedding. And then we go through a process of intimacy, of coming back to it. We don't remain in this transcendent space. But it's very natural, as a progression. It's hard to avoid. It's hard to avoid that progression of separating from life of sorts. There's going to be some feeling of that as we start to tease apart our experience rather than taking it as this like unconscious, undifferentiated blob. So we can make some sense out of it, so we can get out of habitual response. We do that, but then we have to start coming back into life and embracing life, so that way we can participate, we can be intimate with life, we can respond. So I want to make note of that, and I'm glad you brought up that model, because some of this is just going to be natural. Mm-hmm. But if you start, or you change your practice right now to including, for example, the body, that process is going to be much easier. You're going to have less difficult of time of saying, how does this practice relate to life? Mm-hmm. Because you're grounding it in your body, you're grounding it in life. So you can make an easier go at it. Like when I started practicing Buddhism, I did it the other way. I didn't really do much with the body. I just was like, eject out of it, and then had to integrate it. But people are getting wiser now and just starting with the body automatically. Yeah. So those are a few thoughts.
Yeah, no, I like that a lot. And two things come to mind when you were talking. A is how, that transition from mountain, not mountain, to mountain really follows, what Ken describes as sort of the process from fusion to differentiation to integration. Yeah. It's a normal process. And no matter where you are in that process, you are probably exactly where you need to be. That said, there are some unique, I think, challenges and obstacles that present themselves at each of those sort of stages. Yes, and that's what we're trying to sort of, help navigate right now. And then, Ryan, when you were talking about presence, and particularly embodied presence, it actually reminded me of another Zen story, which is one of my favorites. It's a story of this Zen monk who was a very, very diligent meditator, practitioner. And he lived on a lake, across the lake from a friend of his who was a Zen master. And this Zen monk was meditating, and he had this experience of awakening, and it was powerful. And he summarized it in a beautiful poem, which I wrote down here. He says, I bow my head to the heaven within heaven, hairline rays illuminating the universe. The 8 winds cannot move me, sitting still upon the purple golden lotus. It's a beautiful poem.
That's a beautiful poem. Yeah.
Yeah, it's gorgeous. So he sends this. He's, pretty impressed with his own sort of spiritual attainment, right? Yeah. So he sends it to his friend, the Zen master, who lives on the other side of the lake. And the Zen master returns the manuscript. And so the monk opens up the manuscript. So he looks at it, and there's nothing written down except a single word just scribbled over the cover of it. It just says, fart.
That's awesome.
The monk gets pissed off. He's like, who does this guy think he is?
Man. I feel like that's something I would do.
This is beautiful poetry, and this is like my experience of enlightenment and awakening. Who the fuck is this guy? So he angrily goes across the lake to confront the Zen master.
Yeah.
And when he gets there, the Zen master's not there. There's just a note on the door, and the note says, the 8 winds cannot move me, but one fart blows me across the lake.
That's funny. That's good stuff.
I love that story, because it's a difference between having this sort of cognitive understanding of presence and of timeless reality and all that. But the ultimate test is, it's what Ken often says. Does your experience have a beginning in time? Does it have an ending in time? Well, that's nice, but that ain't it. That ain't the real thing. Until you can tap into the experience that has no beginning and has no end, you're it's fine, but you're playing the imaginal game here. You're still playing with spiritual ideas and not necessarily playing in the spiritual territory itself. And every once in a while, you need one big loud fart to remind you, right? That we're sort of leading ourselves on in a certain kind of way.
Yeah. And, so that's great. I'm going to have to write that one down. I feel like I would both be the guy who writes the poem and the guy who writes fart on the poem. Like I'm both people. So I think one advantage that folks who follow integral theory, one of the advantages they have in spiritual practice is dealing with paradox, So for example, Kin didn't just write some books on waking up, he also wrote books on 4 quadrants and lines of development, all these kinds of things. So they're all happening at once, kind of thing. So it's very important to remember this paradox, and that one of my mentors had a great tweet that I still love. He says, "Don't worry, it's just everything and everyone happening all at once." I just love that phrase because that's very true. So, there is timeless presence. And when you're trying to clearly and directly experience that, you have to approach that in a certain way. And that often means letting go. I'm right now leaning towards using the word of release and response. So that's what I have in my model. So release is letting go, is completely letting go until you release completely the source, if you can use other terms. So yeah, you're gonna have to do that. That's what you do, right? So, if you go to the gym, you're gonna work out. If you're gonna write poetry, you pick up a pencil and you're gonna write poetry. It's just different activities. But this timeless presence isn't more real than the manifest reality of this life. Life matters.
Mm-hmm.
What's happening matters, even if, that's a confusing thing that people really goof up in contemplative practices. They start seeing everything as literally illusory, which from the perspective of timeless presence, that's true, like you but still, actually, one of my favorite things I reference in my head, but the movie Dodgeball, which it has a bunch of inappropriate stuff in there, and I get it. Like there's some very politically incorrect things in there, but there's this one scene where what's the guy's name? Rip Torn. He's an old dodgeball player from back in the 50s or something like that. And he was a legend, and he's now trying to teach these goofball, unathletic guys how to play dodgeball. And one of the guys is really repressed with anger. He doesn't show any anger. He's just always, I'm happy, it's fine. And his wife, who apparently is like a mail order bride kind of thing, she hates him, and she's constantly, saying mean things to him, whatever. But he's still just saying everything's fine. And he's sucking at dodgeball. He can't throw the ball at all. And Rip Torn says, "You got to get mad." And he's like, I don't really get mad. And then he punches him in the balls, and he says, "Are you angry now?" And there's that kind of feeling of like, you know what? If someone slapped you across the face or farted in your face, it's like you're gonna have an experience. You're gonna be like, "Oh, this is all an illusion." Yeah, right. So life matters.
Yeah. No, it does. I love that paradox too, because, again, mountain, not mountain.
Yes.
Ramana Maharshi says the world is an illusion.
Yes.
Brahman alone is real.
Right.
Brahman is the world. So there's a complete circuit there. And you have to differentiate sort of, the ultimate reality, which is out there or behind here or back there, however, whatever sort of preposition you want to use to locate it.
Yeah.
But then you have the world itself, which is, this is, we're sort of trapped in this illusion.
Yes.
And that's a really, really important, I think, period in sort of the awakening process, is to realize how much of the world around us, or at least how much of the way we think about the world around us, is ultimately illusionary. But then everything collapses. That sort of probability wave collapses once again, because suddenly Brahman is the world. So if Brahman has been the world this entire time, where's the illusion? There is no illusion. So it's the paradox that you're talking about, being able to sit with that paradox, realizing that this ultimate timeless, unknowable mystery of reality is not different than this conversation that you and I are having right now, and the words that are coming out of my mouth, and the space that I'm in, and our respect and affections for each other, and the ideas we're trying to share. All of this is suffused with that the same amount of ultimate reality as, the internment camps on the border.
Yeah.
All of this sort of shares that same wetness in a certain way.
And that's another great little awakening model that you just shared from Ramana Maharshi. And now the thing is like, so that last stage is non-duality, and we can just refer to that as presence. If we want, we can call it different names. And the practice we were doing is an attempt at that, so we're being present in form, but also that pervasive awareness that is unchanging, uninjurable, inherently whole. We're inhabiting and attuning to both at the same time. Now, that still doesn't tell you what to do with life. So it's not an end. It doesn't say what should be done. And that's a big mistake. That's a big leap that can happen in idealism and spirituality, is that when you get to that stage, you therefore know everything and know how to respond to everything. And that's just bullshit. That's just not the case. We just not the case. We don't have any examples except we have mythical stories about that. But the question is like, okay, still, how does that relate? So somebody, I could hear somebody saying, okay, I've actually had a really profound experience of this non-duality, but now what? Yeah. Because actually in that non-dual experience, there's still a sense of everything is okay. There's a deep, profound okayness. There's no fighting. There's no tension anymore. It's all released in that space. And it's a big relief, that's where you can see like this striving and efforting and spiritual practice, just evaporates, and it's okay, it's relieving. But you still say, okay, now what? Now what am I doing? And that's where that move towards intimacy happens, of saying the world matters. And somehow I'm still going to show up for this and respond to it and struggle with the messiness of life. The thing is that we can infuse that, and we can respond from a different place. So there's some supportiveness that can happen from that spiritual side, if we're going to put sides here of like, releasing into non-dual presence. That can still be supportive of how we show up in life. So a few ways that can happen is one, that we have more room for experience. It doesn't give us absolute room. We don't just have, I have space for everything, no problem. No, we're going to have more room because we have more okayness. We can access that a little bit more. And if there's more room, then there's more ability to see things, to experience things. We can have that more of that intimacy. So yes. We need that. So that's one way that relates. Just less resistance around things. And even when resistance comes up, we can allow space for that. We still have to work with that. So for example, in the body, we might be carrying around trauma or emotional wounds, patterns of relating to the world that no amount of awakening in terms of a non-duality is going to undo. That's still here. I'm 5'10". That ain't changing. I'm not going to be 6'5" tomorrow or whatever. It's like we're still in these forms. These forms persist, and they matter. So, but we can say, well, I want to work with that, and on the foundation of inherent wholeness of this uninjurable space, I can work with that which is injurable.
Yes,
I can work with my experience to change it. So I think it's very possible to integrate those two. And that's exactly what we can do in a practice like this with, Judith's healing practices, is it's built on that foundation of what we did earlier. And then we can work with that manifest condition changing experience. Yeah.
That's beautiful. And what you're talking about, what it really reminds me of is Ken's very simple phrase: hurts more, bothers you less.
Yeah.
And the resilience is what allows you to be bothered less by sort of the pains and the torments of incarnation, right?
Yeah.
But if you don't bring that other side, if you don't bring the hurts more, right, then you remain disembodied in a certain kind of sense, because you're not allowing yourself to feel. Yes, non-duality, the non-dual experience tells us everything is perfect exactly how it is. And that's why there's more urgency than ever to make things better. It's another one of those sort of paradoxes. And, as you're talking, Ryan, it reminds me of some personal experiences that I went through that had a very transformative effect on my own sense of spirituality and how it intersects with my just daily life and identity and all of that. And, and let me just say, up front, I'm generally, these days, I'm not very comfortable for whatever reason talking about my spirituality. It feels intimate to me, and it feels like something that the moment I make it into an object to try to share with someone, it diminishes it somehow. And I'm less interested in sort of the objectification of my own spirit. I'm more interested in inhabiting the sort of the timeless subject of that reality, and a little less so in having, all these sort of spiritual conversations. Now that's very different than where I was, when I first came into Integral, when I was in my 20s. So much of my identity was based on sort of an objectification of my spirituality. I mean, I wore these spiritual ideas like an armor almost, you know what I mean? This became like my new source of identity. I'm having these experiences that are unfolding within me, and they just, gosh, they feel so big and so important and so true. And I just want to let everyone know about it. And I really wore this sort of on my sleeve. And, that was sort of what I consider to be my sort of youthful expression of my own sort of spiritual life. And then, there was a sequence of events that really started to shift things for me. And the first was simply my daughter being born. I mean, you want to talk about maps becoming territory? I mean, if you're interested in developmental maps whatsoever, and then you have a kid, and you're like, okay, here it is, right? This is the territory I've been preparing myself for my entire life. So there's, I think a natural maturation that comes when we have children. But the other thing was, my daughter was, and a lot of people who are watching probably know this story, but for those who don't, my daughter was born with a rare chronic liver disease called biliary atresia, where she was basically born without bile ducts. And she eventually needed a full liver transplant by the time she was a year and a half old, which was harrowing. I mean, it was the most terrifying experience of my life. And it was a crucible that forever changed how I just relate to conversations like these. Because, if you spend any time whatsoever in a children's hospital, I mean, this is the place of nightmares and miracles, right? I mean, you are confronted with sort of the ultimate injustices of the universe. Why the hell are there sick children, right? What kind of God would allow there to be children with cancer and with these just disabilities? And, you spend any time at all in a children's hospital, and it's going to transform you one way or the other. Simply, it doesn't matter how open you are or how closed you are, you're going to walk out of there a different person. And what it did for me, Ryan, is I noticed what it was doing for me is I began to notice in that space how so many of these spiritual ideas and concepts and sort of idolatries, they didn't help. They didn't do anything for me in that space. They didn't give me any sense of additional meaning. They didn't help. They became just sort of ornaments of my spirituality, right? And this experience, I think, stripped away so much of that ornamentation. And the spirituality I walked out with was different than the spirituality I walked in with, in that it became much more quiet. It became much more, much less sort of bombastic. I became much less interested in talking about it, and instead wanted to start talking from it, if that makes sense.
Yes.
And what I began to notice, and and as I'm having this conversation with you, I'm trying to use my mind to sort of objectify it and say, okay, well, what's a basic framework? What did this help me do? And to me, it really felt like it it boiled my spiritual life down to three real simple categories. I mean, real simple, like as simple as it gets. And the first one is what we've been talking about this whole time: presence. Right. And with that presence, I mean, this is sort of one of those, you know, it's a big umbrella of a term, because it's a presence that comes with discovering that unshakable mountain within you, right? And then life becomes sort of an unstoppable object hitting an unmovable subject, right? And life is the explosion that's sort of created. So presence was number one. When I was in that experience, there was something in me that was able to both endure everything, right? That also allowed me to continue just putting one step in front of the other and trust that there will be ground underneath my feet. And that was, I think, the gift of presence. Number two is empathy, right? So much of my spiritual life has been boiled down to basic empathy and human kindness. And especially, you know, we're going to have shows later on about things like social media and things like that, where I think we're really beginning to see the effects of the fact that we are less empathetic today than we were even 20 years ago. There's studies about it. Ken and I just talked about this in our conversation last week about gun violence. Empathy is something like 40% lower today than it was 20 years ago among college students, which is, you know, that's a civilization killer right there. Right. And to me, on a much more personal level, it's like, if your spirituality doesn't have this, it's not just a capacity for empathy, it's a need for empathy. It's, you know, it's part and parcel of that sort of awakening experience, is that I can now slide into perspectives. And sometimes, especially when you're in a children's hospital, sometimes you don't want to slide into other people's perspectives, right? Because it's overwhelming and it squishes you like a bug. You know, it's one of those things like, okay, I am walking through hell right now. And I know in the room right next door to me is someone who's walking through an even worse hell than I am. Right. And I have to choose in the moment, am I going to empathize with that person's experience, or do I have to shut myself down so that I can remain present to my experience? And I think that there is, again, it's a developmental sort of thing. You kind of do sometimes have to oscillate. It's really hard to do both at the same time. But at the end of the day, you're naturally doing Tonglen for, you know, every person, every face, every kid that you see in a hospital like that. It just starts to come online sort of naturally, because it actually, in a certain way, it's sort of a selfish way of coping. Even like, I'm going to drown in this if I don't find some way to metabolize it and to process it. Yeah. That's the second piece, is empathy. And then the third is simply, you know, it's the most difficult to talk about, but it's skillful action in order to reduce suffering where you see it. And that gets really, I mean, there's all sorts of different moral algorithms out there that people use to determine how, you know, what skillful action is and what reducing suffering actually means. And it's not, you know, it's not a very clean space. It's not, you know, sometimes you have to be deliberately partial in order to create the most good for the most people, et cetera. It's a lot more difficult than just saying skillful action, but still there is a simplicity there. There's this thing that comes in line in you that just wants to be able to navigate the noise in a certain kind of way, and to make your contributions so that other people don't have to suffer as much as they do. And the three of those combined, just presence, empathy, skillful action, to me, it's like this has become a new integral framework for me. That is, it's sort of the simplicity on the other side of a lot of complexity. You know what I mean? And it took a lot of complexity and a lot of trauma and a lot of heartache to sort of get there. But now that I'm there, you know, it's just funny how you might be, I'm uncomfortable talking about it right now, because I don't want to diminish that, but by simply trying to make those aspects of my subjective experience into an object, I feel like even in discussing them, I'm sort of fetishizing them in a certain kind of sense. And it's not altogether comfortable. And that discomfort is a new experience for me. And I'm actually trying to figure out how to let that inform wherever I am in that awakening sequence right now. I'm trying to allow that to come online in a more authentic and a more full way. So that was just for me an example of how, all of this imaginal stuff, which meant so much to me. And again, it becomes almost mythological. It's like, what is the universe and what is my place in it? And you can see all the demons and angels and, all of that sort of laid out in front of you. And then there's just the acceptance of the radical simplicity of ordinary reality as it presents itself to you right now and right now and right now.
Yeah. That's really beautiful, Corey. I'm very happy you shared that. I think it's such a great example. And I don't know. I don't see any issues with you expressing that. I don't know. You said about your uncomfortableness. So, I mean, like to me, that's what it's about is everything you just shared. I think that was a really beautiful, heartfelt, genuine, authentic expression of that deep, natural integration of what we consider spiritual and what we consider life, where that separation collapses. All the idealism, that's a big deal. Like all that idealism is evaporated. And if that's not evaporated yet, there's still more to go. And some people are thrust into that, like you were with your daughter. You didn't have a choice about that, and so you had to just go through that. And honestly, sometimes, depending on people's spiritual inclinations, sometimes they could double down in some traumatic ways on ideals as their coping mechanism. Yeah, and then that can get real painful and really ugly.
Yep.
But I think a lot of people, that's what happens. It's just like, what's true still? What remains? And it's a very powerful filtering process when you go through something that's traumatic and difficult. So I think,
well, what I noticed, Ryan, is that each three of those sort of pillars, right, they really depend on each other. I mean, they really do. Yeah. If you have all the empathy without the resiliency, you drown in it, right? Yeah. I mean, you just absolutely drown in it. And if you have the resiliency without the empathy, you just sort of become cold to it all. And if you don't have, at least the desire to create skillful action in your life and in the world, then you're just sort of impotent with it all and you're just stuck with it. So much of spirituality can already feel like masturbation and navel gazing. And you know what I mean? It becomes just so self-centered. Like I'm trying to find all these ways to cultivate myself and to awaken myself and to do all these things within myself. And what often gets lost is like, okay, well, that's awesome, but what are you doing for your community? What are you doing to make your neighbors feel more seen and more loved and more, what are you doing to actually reduce suffering right now in the world? And there's not any one answer to that, but the question is that present for you? Are those drives present for you right now? And that to me just becomes sort of the stuff at the core,
Yeah. Well, I mean, basically that's kind of circling back around to the beginning here of, what's our intention with spiritual practice? Honestly, what is it? Not what do we say it is, but what is it? Often for most of us, it is, I want to escape. I want to get beyond this suffering of life, and that's the movement at first. It's just like, how the hell can I get around it? Because life sucks, and, but taken too far, it's like, and it's an escape. So if we're escaping, we're trying to transcend. And then even worse, we're like then trying to create out these big ideas about how life is and try to live in these, godlike realms of spirituality. And it's like, okay, versus dealing with the nitty gritty of life. And it doesn't, like I said before, in your experience, all that idealism just gets evaporated and drops away. And what remains is something that's way more authentic, way more immediate. It doesn't change. It doesn't necessarily mean that there's not something profound, like that gets talked about in contemplative traditions. It's not that like, oh, there's nothing profound or extraordinary. It's just that what that experience is and how we experience it in life is very different. Like it's very different if you're going on a retreat and trying to get out of the world and trying to access some transcendent experience and be like, oh yeah, this is it. This is where I want to be, forever.
Yeah.
Versus like that experience at the hospital, of like, ooh, of being cracked open completely, in a similar way, really. But it has a totally different quality and meaning and purpose. So, and I like, the phrase you said, talk about it versus talk from it. That's a big differentiator. Is how much are we talking about it versus how much are we talking from it as it. So when we were doing that practice earlier, living as the space in the body, not aware of it, that changes things. And at that point, like, that's why I think, like, I guess it's, you worried about how you're talking about fetishizing or anything like that. It's like, I think that actually it's the opposite. That doesn't happen. It doesn't matter what the words are, but when it's coming from a organic expression, one's lived experience, to me, it's always beautiful, no matter how articulate or inarticulate it is. It's worth so much more than any pontificating, about spirituality when it's about, even if it's pointing to something. So that's a really great way of saying, is like, am I living as this, from this, or am I creating it as some object to continually chase?
Yeah, I get the sense that where I am in that process right now is sort of an overcorrection in my steering from, again, from just having such a spiritualized ego for so long, right? And feeling like, God, aren't I fucking important because I have this spiritualized ego, and God, I'm going to do important things, and that's going to make me feel important. And it's so much of it just becomes, again, these ego games. Now, when it comes to integral spirituality, I want to remind people, the goal of integral spirituality is not, spirituality is not hostile to the ego, even though the ego can oftentimes be hostile to spirituality, right? So I think the spiritual impulse is to not kill the ego, but to make the ego transparent to itself, to make, you're actually trying to make the ego bigger, right? That's what development is you're incrementally making your ego bigger and bigger and bigger, more capable, more capable, more capable. But you're also, through these awakening experiences, making it that much more transparent. However, the one thing I notice is that from the perspective of your ego, and this is, I think, one of the reasons, Ryan, why it can be so hard for us to grok just how radically simple these enlightenment experiences can be, because from the point of view of our ego, the ego says, okay, well, if I'm going down in a blaze of glory. You know what I mean? The ego wants like CGI explosions for that sort of radical spiritual territory on the other side of it all. It expects these like, and these big visions of light and love. And oftentimes that's not how it presents itself. Sometimes it does, but oftentimes it's really not how it presents itself. I remember, reading Ken, as you were mentioning, just how Ken writes about these things. And what Ken will do often is he'll just write, page after page of this beautiful prose that is so intellectually nourishing, and it illuminates so much of reality, and and we just eat it up, we devour it. And then at the end of those paragraphs, he'll just write this little simple paragraph, this beautiful Zen sort of description. And not only does it sort of act as a almost like grokking point for everything he just said, all the pieces kind of come together in those little poems, but he's also sort of moving out of all that complexity and reminding us how simple this really is, right? At its very core, just how simple. It's so simple, you almost always miss it. That's how simple it is. And in my 20s, when I was reading that, it was almost like, he writes it in such a way that, you can feel sort of your mental constructs that he just spent pages reinforcing for you. Then he gives you this little Zen poem, and they kind of fall away, and you get a taste of that experience. You get a taste of that territory. But I remember after sort of mind comes back, right? And now I'm thinking about, that little blip of an experience I just had, how, in a certain kind of way, unsatisfying it felt. It felt not to me, but to my ego. Because again, my ego wanted an explosion. It wanted to go down in this, firework display.
Exactly.
And instead I just get chop wood, carry water.
Yeah, that's eventually where things go. That's kind of what we said at the beginning, is that like there is naturally some developmental process there. And even if we start with a model of awakening that includes that, where we say, okay, we're not going to front here. We're going to say, like, in the end, this is going to be very, very ordinary. But, for a while, it might be like, well, this is really kind of fascinating. It's kind of like, cool. Oh, wow. That's going to be natural. We don't have to like poo-poo it, but like just to be aware of it. And, when we talk about the perfection and the simplicity, it's very important sometimes when people think about these words, because sometimes they get a little confused. Like when we talk about non-dual presence of being like just this thusness. It's perfect because nothing needs to be done. That's why that word is used. It's not a qualitative assessment. Like we normally say, oh, this piece of chocolate's perfect. There's an ideal there, but it's sort of almost pragmatic of like no matter where you move, no matter what you do, no matter what you think, nothing doesn't change that foundational presence. It always is. It's just taking different forms. So that's why we say perfect, or if you want to say, sometimes the word pure is used and people get confused about that. And that's how you can see that in spiritual communities where they emphasize some sort of external purity, as like, oh, that's what we got to do is be pure. And that's a condition. But nothing you can do to fundamental reality is going to make it impure or pure. It's nothing. It's as it is. So I just wanted to make mention of those two terms because we use it a couple of times. But that's why it's all really simple. It's really ordinary, and chop wood and carry water because it doesn't need anything. But the world does need things. And that's where we talked about response. And your example of in your life, I think, is a beautiful, just heart-filled example of those of spirituality and life happening all at once, such that there wasn't even a differentiation. In that moment, words don't even come close, to describing it.
Yeah. It's one of those things where, thank you, Lord, for these traumas.
Yeah.
Yeah. And more than anything, just thank you, Lord, that my little girl is doing so well.
Yeah. A beautiful daughter and family.
Yeah.
And quick thing, there's that Stephen Colbert, Anderson Cooper interview going around.
Yeah, I haven't watched it yet, but I've heard it's absolutely touching. I love it when Colbert talks about his grieving process.
Yeah, the two of them it's one of the most genuine, vulnerable conversations I've seen in kind of mass media or media of that size, of Colbert and Anderson Cooper. I was like, wow, the cameras could have been off and I felt like they would have been exactly the same. And so they spend half that interview, it's a long one, like 40 minutes or so, but they spend half of it talking about their grief. And Colbert is really fascinating because, he's a Catholic. So in terms of integral theory, the way he talks about his religion sometimes would be like, oh, is this an ethnocentric sort of sociocentric version of Catholicism? But then other ways, in ways he lives, his spirituality, he's deep to me. And he said in there, he said something. Anderson Cooper was quoting him about life, and it was, I think it's actually from Lord of the Rings, which another thing I love about Colbert.
Totally.
It's something about like punishments of life are also gifts, something like that. And Colbert said that existence is a gift and existence is filled with suffering. And it's very simple, and that's like when you were talking about your story, like when I hear that, I don't care about any amount of the books I've had and the retreats and things I've done and these experiences. It almost anymore, it's like, that's what matters. Like that, what he just said there, and the way he said it and the way that it was felt, because he lost his dad and brothers when he was little, and Anderson Cooper lost a brother and his mom recently, and what you went through, something gets hollowed out in a good way. It's like, there's like gratitude because existence is miraculous.
Yeah.
It's miraculous and mysterious, and there's suffering, and suffering in what he said in terms of empathy, suffering lets us know that other people suffer and that we want to be kind and show up, so that just reminded me what your story and then what he was saying there. So I recommend people check that interview out. It's really beautiful.
Isn't it fascinating, Ryan, that he's able to sort of summarize it in such a simple way? Again, just this elegant simplicity, and he's able to use phrases where if you just heard the phrase, does that sound Catholic or does that sound Buddhist?
He actually says in that interview, he's like, so I'm either Catholic or Buddhist.
Well, there you go.
Yeah, and I think that's too, like in terms of simplicity, that's a big shift in terms of the developmental stages of awakening. Is that things get, my experience and other people I know, things get simpler. Like you don't have to have a bunch of pizzazz, to talk about things. And that can be tricky for somebody who's a beginner, in particular in a tradition that has a lot of hoorah, because they can see that and gloss right over it and be like, that's not really profound. That's just whatever, there's something else. It's like, no, that's right there.
Yep. And it's not that sort of anti-intellectual drive to simplicity, which is the first mountain. The first mountain is sort of the anti-intellectual simplicity. The third mountain, when the mountain becomes a mountain again, that's post-intellectual. That's again, it's the simplicity on the other side of all that complexity.
Yeah.
Right. And there's a good chance you wouldn't even be able to be aware of that simplicity if you hadn't already gone through that painful differentiation and those dark nights and the suffering and the anguish and the torment of being a separate self in an expanding universe, right?
Yeah.
Where everything really does have some level of disconnection from everything else. Then that collapses. And when it does, it's just, it's simplicity returns in this really, really profound way where, just everything sort of self-liberates in a certain kind of way.
That's exactly right, my friend. Yeah. Well, it's been great. I don't know. I loved our discussion. I'm hoping it's helpful. I don't know if do we have anybody who's watching live? I know like we're beginning the show and we kind of fudged the time and stuff like that. So there wasn't a bunch of heads up, but is there anybody who's live?
So there are people watching live. I think most of them are on integrallife.com/live, or they're watching on YouTube. But I'll let you guys know. We'll give you a minute or two to see if you want to do this. There's a link right underneath the video player on integrallife.com/live that'll bring you into the Zoom app. So if you had something you wanted to say, any feedback or comments, questions, anything like that, we definitely invite you to hop on with us. You can either press the raise my hand button, which will tell us you want us to turn on your camera, and then you can talk to us in real time, or you can submit a written Q&A. And if you don't have anything for today, that's fine. We hope you guys will join us next month for our third show. And because, Ryan, we really do. We want to make this as interactive as possible. It's one thing for us to sort of sit here and talk to each other about, our own sort of experiences and all that. But we really want to, use this as a platform for everyone else in the audience to share your perspectives and your experiences and your practices and all of that. So if we don't have any questions for today, that's totally fine. But I hope you guys will join us next time and be a part of the conversation.
I forget how much delay there is between the live stream and
like 10 seconds.
Oh, it's just 10 seconds. Okay.
Yeah, it's short.
Well, we'll give people maybe a minute just in case they want to take some minute to get on there. But we forgot. We should have mentioned that at the beginning to say that we would.
Yeah, I probably should have.
Well, I'm trying to remember that next time.
Yeah. But in the meantime, is there anything that we want to talk about? Anything coming up? I mean, we should definitely talk about your embodied success course that we have on integrallife.com.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think we mentioned last time, but anybody who's doing their own business or own, organization or teaming up with people where you're really trying to figure out how to put out offerings in the world and have them be sustainable and that kind of thing, then the things that we've been talking about, how do you do that in the realm of business? And, the thing is, like, I even want to think of a different word, but there's just no way around it in this society of like what we're doing, because that's how it is, business, capitalism, things like that. So that course I created to try to bring in more depth to business. It also does have, so it has that component of the inner work that we've been talking a ton about today, and applying it to the creative world and functional world of business. And then there's a whole bunch of lessons on actually doing business, where to me, it's about it's a very complete training, to do that. So if you're needing that support, then definitely look at that.
Yeah, well, and the way I sort of interpret that, Ryan, is the third leg I talked about was skillful action. And
Yes,
that's what this course is here to do, is to help you understand how to take action in a more skillful and, ultimately more successful way. Here, success isn't just defined by how much money you make, although that's certainly part of it, right?
Yeah, and in that program, I consistently don't give an answer like this is the answer.
Right.
I'm trying to help people cultivate capacities, whether it's in the inner realm, like in terms of inhabiting, or in the outer realm. How do I communicate with people? And get them, help them be aware of what I'm doing, that kind of thing. It's all capacities, of how to navigate skillful means, because you got to have that responsiveness in life about how to navigate that and feel centered in your work and business. And rather than you chasing something that's always feeling outside of oneself, because sometimes success happens and sometimes it doesn't, but it doesn't mean that you can't feel at home in the work you're doing and feel capable.
That's right. Yeah, well said. So yeah, I definitely encourage people to go check that out. It's on integrallife.com/courses. Yeah, you can definitely check that out. And otherwise, brother.
Yeah.
I think this has been wonderful.
Well, wonderful. This has been really fun. And I hope people have enjoyed it. And I would love to hear if people are watching later. I know there's different places to put comments in for Integral Life. So share your comments, your thoughts, questions. Future episodes, we haven't decided what we have a bunch of things we listed out. We don't know what the next one's going to be, but I know we talked about social media. We talked about politics. What are some other topics we're considering, Corey?
We had, so one I wanted to do was one on inhabiting your life purpose. Which would sort of bring in the idea of like an integral ikigai, which if you're not familiar with ikigai, that's a cool Japanese concept. I think it sheds a lot of light on what life purpose really means. Inhabiting your anxiety and your traumas is another thing that we could do. But basically the idea is that every episode is naming a particular territory that we want to more fully bring ourselves to.
And we'll get more specific. With these first few episodes, I think we really needed to lay a good foundation that's going to permeate everything else we do, but we're going to dive in much more specifically. So if there are areas of life or themes that you're interested in, you can let us know that too.
That's right. Yeah, what I'll do, Ryan, is there'll be comments underneath this video on Integral Life where members can let us know what they think and give feedback and ask questions. Great. I'll also add a question form. So if anyone wants to just submit a question privately, we can do that. And if we select your question, hey, we'll let you know. We'll invite you onto the program next time we do it so that you can ask us in real time and have a little back and forth with us, and it'll be fun.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
Well, this is awesome. Looking forward to the next one.
Yeah, brother. Ryan, thank you so much, man.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. This is a really cool thing we're doing together, I think.
Yeah, I'm super enjoying it, and I hope listeners have been enjoying it too.
Totally. All right, buddy. Well, I love you, man. And I will talk to you soon.
All right.
And to everyone else out there, I'm Corey DeVos. That's Ryan Oakey. And we will talk to you soon. All right. Let me just stop.